Hey everyone, I wanted to give you some feedback on lesson five, which is one of my personal favorite lessons. They're all kind of my favorites, but it's like trying to choose between children. But I just find it just really resonates, and it's something that this notion of development and quality of life, and the pursuit of development versus the pursuit of GDP growth, and also the negative implications of GDP growth. This is something that is so sort of like iconoclastic, and people just don't ever think of this, but it's really, really important as a concept. So, just a couple of items of feedback. One of the really important things to understand from a sustainability perspective is that money itself has no inherent value, right? Like I could this piece of paper here, that has what I could burn it and generate a little warmth maybe, but other than that, like what is it good for? It's only good because of what it can do for you, and that may not seem like a significant um, difference, but it certainly is. I mean, because it sort of like follows that if if you don't have money but you have all these things, like if you're not wealthy but you have access to health care and education and your neighborhood's safe and you have housing and you have food, etc., etc. If you have access to all those things and you don't have a lot of money, is it really that important? I mean, if you can still access these things that help promote a high quality of life, then money is really not all that important. So I think that's really important context to keep in mind, hopefully, through the rest of your life, but just in general, I want you to think about that. Like money itself, like what does being richer do for you? Maybe it boosts your ego a little bit or something, but really money is good because things in society cost money. So of course it's better to have money so you can buy these things. But the point is, if you don't have to have a bunch of money to get these things, then money becomes less important. Okay, so that's kind of underlying this whole thing, this whole lesson, and some of the other lessons. And in sort of a related note, poverty, although we define it by income, because we need to put a specific number behind it. Um, Poverty is really not a lack of income. It's a lack of resources. It's a lack of food. It's a lack of other things. So that's one reason why I put that multi-dimensional poverty index from the United Nations in there, because money is only part of that. There's like child mortality and education rates and access to food and all that sort of stuff. So all of these different factors that would make someone quote unquote poor are, again, like if I'm dirt poor financially, but I have a roof over my head, I grow enough of my own food, I have good social resources, I live in a safe area, I have freedom, I have democracy, all of those things, my children are healthy, I have access to health care, whatever the case may be. Um, that means that you're not really poor because you have the things that you need to survive. Okay, so again, really important. It's not money itself, but what money can do for you. A couple of you had a couple of issues with the genuine progress indicator. That's just a metric. Um, that's it's one of the many metrics that's an alternative to just straight up GDP. If you're interested in that, I would look at the state of Maryland. I think there was a slide or two that had some specifics from their um, GPI. And so the state of Maryland started doing this, I can't remember how long ago, 5, 10 years, where the state government actually, what they do is for their sort of see how their economy is doing, they say, well, there's the GDP side of things, right? So the straight up like finished goods and services, and but they also add to GDP when things are good, like people have more access to the environment, more people are more educated, people are healthier, and so forth. And they actually subtract from GDP when people have more health problems and more addiction problems and less equity and so forth. So you sort of have GDP as a starting point, right? And then you pull away from it if things aren't as fully developed as you'd like them to be. Like so, if the literacy rate goes down a little bit, then that GPI is going to go down. If the overall health or the lifespan of people go down, that GPI is going to go down. If people have less access to education, the GPI is going to go down, and then vice versa, right? So what it does is it takes GDP as a basis and then, excuse me, and expands on it. And that's your GPI. I just think it's interesting because what it really does is count externalities. If you think about it, positive externalities count positively toward GPI, negative externalities count negatively toward GPI. So it's a good way to integrate externalities into sort of hard numbers. Um, the happiness index to me is, it may seem really, excuse me, I'm sorry. It may seem almost like, like a little out there, like, hey, we just want people to be happy. But I mean, in all seriousness, if you think about it, this is a really important question. If people don't have much money, or even if they don't have healthcare, even if they're not free, maybe they're a female in a male-dominated society or whatever, but they're happy. The question is, how important is it to provide these things that we consider part of a high quality of life? But if they're like, well, look, I don't even care about money. I don't really care about being educated, or care about fill in the blank, and they're like perfectly happy, they live perfectly satisfied, happy lives. I mean, there's some certainly an argument to be made that maybe we care less about these objective things that we measure and more about subjective happiness. All that being said, you're much less likely to be happy if you don't have access to education. You're not empowered. You don't have the power to vote. You don't have strong family ties. You don't feel safe. That sort of thing. Like, that's going to lead to unhappiness naturally. But the point is, like, really the ultimate goal is for quality of life. And people are like, hey, I'm totally happy. I have this great quality of life. Then that's actually a really good way to measure it. So that it may sound almost unserious, but people do take it seriously. This happiness report has really become kind of a big thing in terms of national and international development. And then you know a major sort of underlying theme again is this skepticism of GDP, and I think all of you really picked up pretty well on what is inadequate about GDP. And be really, really clear that GDP isn't like some evil metric that's, just bad for everybody, bad for the environment, and like more money it makes everything worse. Like, I don't want you to think that that's the case, because it's not. Um, an increasing GDP generally does bring people out of poverty. It generally does mean people are doing better overall. It generally means people have more access to healthcare and education and so forth. The problem is it's not a one-to-one relationship, right? And a lot of you picked up on that. And GDP can go up. I mean, look at what's happening now. GDP is going up, inequality is going up, right? So we have GDP rising. The wealthy are doing really, really well right now, and those lower on the income scale, not as much. So GDP says nothing about inequality. Um, it says nothing about this invisible labor that's provided, for example, by people that raise children, which of course disproportionately falls on women in the US and globally. And so none of that is counted toward GDP. Volunteer, not counted toward GDP. Bartering, right? So if, like, I trade my services with you, but it doesn't, the money doesn't exchange hands, that doesn't count. I mean, heck, even things like Craigslist, because it's not a finished good, it's a secondary good. The secondary good market doesn't count. Um, and also, as you saw, there's a lot of things, negative things that can and do occur because of rising GDP, like environmental damage, exploitation of marginalized people, and so forth. So when you think about it, it's actually obvious. And if you look at the statistics and you just think about the logic of it all, it's totally obvious. But this is just not something that people think about. They think like GDP's up, that's good. But really, you can see there's a lot of problems with that. And the last thing I really want to mention is a lot of you pointed to prisons as something that are nominally good for GDP, but bad for sustainability, bad for development. And you couldn't be more right. And I just wanted to make a couple of points in that regard. There is a term, the prison industrial complex, which you may have heard before or not. But it's a play on the words of, I think it was Truman, President Truman, who warned us about the military industrial complex when I think it was 1958, when he didn't run for president. In his farewell speech, he warned us against the military industrial complex, which a lot of you actually mentioned as well. If you think about what's going on right now in Ukraine, uh, there's defense companies' stocks are way up. Like they are profiting immensely from this. People like the Rand Corporation, Lockheed Martin, and so forth. All these defense contractors. I mean, they thrive on these things. I mean, this is how they make their money. And so that's the kind of thing that a lot of people are skeptical of the intents of many countries, the United States included, when it comes to these military conflicts, and what their motivations are for engaging in them or supporting them aren't always just about democracy and being on the quote unquote right side. There's no doubt that there's a huge motivation for a lot of these companies to promote military conflict, and we all know that lobbying is a major part of why legislation happens and why politicians make decisions. Unfortunately, it's the people with the power are the ones that are um, more influential than the folks like you and me. And so, anyway, Truman warned us about this military-industrial complex, and he was right, of course. And that's part of a big part of this lesson is um, the GDP benefits of something that's obviously bad for people. I mean, ask the people of Ukraine if they're happy about the Rand Corporation stock price going up right now. Um, but the prison industrial complex is similar, and it's just absolutely skyrocketed. I just want to throw a few statistics at you just to show you how disproportionate it is in the United States. So the U.S., for example, has 5% of the world's population. Five. Guess the percent of prisoners we have in the world? 20. So we have 20% of the world's prison population, only 5% of the actual population. So we're more than any other country in the world, or at least industrialized modern country in the world. We imprison our population. It's just not normal in most other countries. Since 1970, the incarcerated population has increased by 500%, which is way outpacing population growth. When you get to the social, environmental, or social justice side of things, these statistics are just startling. So according to the ACLU, 1 out of every 3 black boys in the U.S. can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. 1 out of 3. For white people, 1 out of 17 white boys, 1 out of 17, and about 1 out of 6 Latino boys can expect to be in prison. So there's even though criminality rates, crime rates, excuse me, aren't significantly different among races, um, you're more likely to be incarcerated or even arrested if you are a person of color. And then you get to the cost of prisons. So the federal and state prison system costs about $80 billion a year. Much of that is in private hands. So if you're not aware, there are private companies that build prisons, and then usually the federal government, sometimes state government, pays them to house their prisoners, right? This has become a humongous industry, multi-billion-dollar industry. So if you think about the sort of awfulness of this, if I own a private prison company, I want to maximize my profits, right? So get that GDP up, get that golden GDP up. How do I do that? I don't know. Maybe I won't provide healthcare as much as they should get. Maybe I'll just cut back on the food a little bit. Maybe I'll cut back on the number of guards so I don't have to pay people as much, which increases my profits. As you can see, there's some very perverse motivations to increase the profit of private prisons. Not to mention, the more people I put in prison, the more money I make. So I actually want people to be in prison. And you can actually find examples in these. So a lot of these prisons are in these sort of like small, rural-ish type areas. It's a little easier to do things there, more space, cheaper land, all that sort of stuff. And these small communities often become very dependent on that income, that tax income and so forth from these prisons. And when they move to de-incarcerate people and shut down prisons, there's actually pushback from the community to like not having people in jail. And it's not because of a safety thing, it's because of all the money that they bring in. So now we're entangling the prison system into our GDP, which has become a really big problem. So there's just all kinds of issues related to that. In the US in particular, we really like to put people in prison. And unfortunately, you're much more likely to end up in prison if you're a person of color. And then if you look into anything about the drug war that started in the 60s and 70s, but really increased in the 80s, widely considered the biggest failed piece of government, this initiative, maybe ever, in the United States. So the quote unquote war on drugs, total failure, and all it ended up doing was criminalizing and putting a bunch of people in prison, mostly low-income people and disproportionately people of color. Just an abject failure that's now sort of set the tone where we just expected to have this huge prison population. It's really hard to unwind that after it's already been implemented. So something worth keeping your eye on, because this is something, again, to sort of like bring it all back home. Like, what can you do about all this? Certainly, policies are a really important way to do this. So if you start getting involved in paying attention to politicians that really legitimately want to change this problem or support nonprofits, um, like I think it's called the Fair Sentencing Project. There's all kinds of nonprofits out there that advocate to make these changes to make it more fair. Um, and so it's definitely a major issue in the United States that is worth paying attention to. Okay, so I'll leave it at that, and I'm glad to hear that most of you are enjoying the content, and let me know if you have any questions.